So, dear participants, dear colleagues, and dear friends, welcome to today's meeting of the Leuven Seminar in Classical German Philosophy. This session will entirely be devoted to the Fichte studies by Friedrich von Hardenberg, who is also known as Novalis. The speakers of today are Violetta Waibel, James Reid, and Alexander Knopf. Each of them will give a short talk on the Fichte studies, and after each talk, there will be room for questions and/or discussion. Please make sure that you remain muted during the talks and that you unmute yourself only when you are given the floor to ask a question or to take part in the discussion. I would also like to invite all participants to keep their camera running so as to create an agreeable and less anonymous virtual meeting space. But of course, this is just a suggestion and no mandatory requirement for participation. As usual, once the official program has ended, we will keep open the Zoom meeting in order to allow for more informal discussions and encounters. Then it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker of this session, Professor Violetta Waibel. Violetta Waibel is Professor of European Philosophy and Continental Philosophy at the University of Vienna, where she teaches German classical philosophy and philosophy of art and aesthetics. She is the author of a monograph on Hölderlin and Fichte. So the title is Hölderlin und Fichte, 1794-1800, which was published in 2000. And she is about to publish 2 volumes on the Fichte Studien. The Fichte Studien, which is the subject of today's session. And the title of these monographs, so double volume monograph, is System der Systemlosigkeit, erster Teil, die Fichte-Studien Friedrich von Hardenbergs, Denkwerkstatt im philosophischen Kontext von Kant und Fichte, und zweiter Teil, ein philosophisch-systematischer Kommentar der Fichte-Studien Friedrich von Hardenbergs. So she is, I think, a suitable speaker for a session on Friedrich von Hardenberg's Fichte studies. Professor Waibel is the editor or co-editor of 12 collective volumes, among which a series on Kant and German idealism that runs under the title System der Vernunft. And she also co-edited the proceedings of the 12th International Kant Congress, which she organized in Vienna in 2015. I also mentioned the volume Fichte and the Phenomenological Tradition, which she co-edited with Daniel Briesel and Tom Rockmore. This was published in 2010 by De Gruyter. Well, I won't mention all her writings, of course, so I will go directly to the title of her talk today. The title is The Drive to be an I is at the same time the drive to think and to feel. Hardenberg, Novalis on drives, faculties, and powers. And please join me in welcoming Professor Waibel.
Thank you very much, Henny Blomme, for this very kind introduction. Thank you very much, Karin de Boer, for this invitation. So, interrelation. The Fichtean notion of Wechselbestimmung is very dominant in the Fichte studies of Friedrich von Hardenberg, especially the interrelation of feeling and thinking, the feeling of the absolute or pure I, and the thinking of the subject. Hardenberg coined another now famous terminology, that of ordo inversus or inverso ordinem. This figure of thoughts sometimes appears explicitly, sometimes implicitly in his Fichte studies. And I want to present here this context, the interrelation or order inversus of thinking and feeling. When Hardenberg speaks of the genesis of drive in Fichte study 44, you find a handout, and there are many of the Fichte studies, some translated most in English and some with a German text, because the Fichte studies translating is very difficult. It's a very special language that Hardenberg used. Also, when Hardenberg speaks of the genesis of the drive in Fichte study 44, he's addressing the absolute I and its relation to the relative I that he calls the subject. This reminds us of Fichte study 32. Its title is On the Empirical I, and the opening question here is, how does the absolute I become an empirical I? It is clear that the absolute I in Hardenberg's reflections is an instance of isolation and abstraction, but should not be taken in a literal sense as an absolute. It is the instance of normative, ideal, and law, including the laws of thought that appears in the empirical subject. Hardenberg notes in Fichte study 32, the absolute I is at once both a united and a divided thing. And then he goes on in 32. This is, however, the famous conflict within the I, which constitutes its character, which is already to be found in the absolute original act. And then he goes on. The conflict is as conflict merely in the mediated I, and is necessarily, precisely, because it is not originally a conflict, one need only pay heed to the inverted order inversus, of the mediated I, because this is the actual ground of the contradiction. This is the very first time in the Fichte studies where Hardenberg speaks not only of contradiction, that is Widerstreit or Wechselbestimmung, he uses both German terms, but of the order inversus. On the basis of his previously developed interrelation between feeling and reflection, which is located at a higher level of complexity compared to intellectual intuition and original act. These are two notions or expressions that appear very often. Original act in German is Urhandlung. Hardenberg feels justified in also assuming the relationship between the empirical I and the absolute I according to the very same structure, provided the absolute I is thought of as an independent original form that correlates with a relative form determined by matter. Sorry. And its relation to the empirical I, the absolute I is only mediated. He writes, thus, there are two mediated I's at hand. The I that is felt and the I that is thought. That's in Fichte study 32. And he goes on, the absolute I goes from the infinite to the finite, the mediated I from the finite to the infinite. So when the absolute I interacts with the empirical I, Hardenberg again has to ask himself the following question, quotation, but how does the absolute I arrive at the finite? Where it then is a mediated I according to its own laws? The considerations Hardenberg comes up with after revisiting his question are outlined in the second part of the short text and make clear that he understands the absolute I as a mental unity, which represents the indeterminate ideal of pure reason and its legitimacy. For the question relevant here, Hardenberg uses the context of the absolute I, which is familiar to Fichte's thinking in the foundation of the entire Wissenschaftslehre, and therefore he writes, the undetermined ideal of the pure I is thus characteristic of the I in general. Hardenberg mentions a second characteristic of the I. The pure I is only divided insofar as it is one, and is only one insofar as it is divided. This is, however, the famous conflict within the I, which constitutes its character as an ordo inversus, Fichte Study 32. In Hardenberg's Fichte Study, the notion of feeling is immensely upgraded because it describes the original character of philosophy. Using the adjective original, Ur in German, reminds us of the philosophy's very beginning in ontogenetic and phylogenetic terms. It reminds us of the translation of the Greek word philosophy, meaning the love of wisdom. It reminds us of enthusiasm, of life as a driving force, of the feeling of freedom to pursue truth and the striving and wanting to find it. Even his frequently asked question of what philosophy is driven by the question and method of philosophy from the earlier non-philosophical understanding of the world. Although feeling and its varieties are often mentioned, one does not find the quality of feeling specified. Its most striking determination is being the antipode of reflection, thought, and knowledge. Illuminating and to contemplating this antithesis is the subject of an abundance of notes in the Fichte studies. In Fichte Study 15, Hardenberg asks, what is then a feeling? The answer, which is thought through within the Fichte studies and also in numerous other passages, seeks to find a determination of the relative indeterminacy of feeling, although, as Hardenberg insists, this specific determination at the same time negates the essence of feeling. Hardenberg adds, it can only be observed in reflection. The spirit of feeling is then gone with reflection. Here Hardenberg makes one of his fundamental propositions that shows the importance he attaches to understanding the method associated with the ordo inversus. Moreover, in Fichte Study 15, he writes, feeling cannot feel itself. This is a self-evident statement. One has a feeling of whatever kind, but one does not feel the feeling. This sentence shows that a feeling needs another of its kind in order to be grasped and understood and even given a specification. It holds also true that a feeling loses something of its original quality as soon as one tries to keep it in mind, to transform it, its fleeting appearance, and to think about it or examine it. Hardenberg does use a feeling to describe the beginning of the philosophizing, but he does not define it. The feeling that points to the need, even the drive, to philosophize is therefore not given a specification. Astonishment, however, is a feeling that one is accustomed to associate with the origin and drive of philosophizing. However, this is not what Hardenberg seems to be talking about here. He does not use these specifications. In Fichte Study 19, Hardenberg writes only, I quote, reflection finds the need of philosophy or of an assumed systematic connection between thinking and feeling, because the need is in feeling. The need of philosophy is understood as a feeling and so stands in contrast to reflection. Here, one might note that need could also be identified as drive. However, Hardenberg does not use this specific term here that he uses so often elsewhere. The feeling of need is obviously distinguished from the feeling of amazement here. Probably both moments are only two sides of the same coin. Amazement expresses the subject's affection, which is evoked by wonder or appreciation for an object. The object may be sensually given or ideally thought. Amazement then leads to a closer examination of the specific object and a deeper engagement with it. In contrast, need is a subject-oriented feeling. Subjects expressing need have the feeling of lacking something, and it may be undetermined how this lack can be satisfied. In Fichte Study 19, Hardenberg unites the back and forth direction of feeling and reflection in two schemes. You have this on the handout, and I think this is very central for Hardenberg's understanding of the relation of feeling and reflection or thinking. The schemes indicating the sequence of number 1 to 4 are to be read from left to right on the one hand and from right to left on the other. And there are, if you can see it on the handout, 2 schematizations that have to be mirrored into themselves. He calls the schematization the basis of all philosophizing. Is it is worth to look at the whole passage, but I don't want to read this whole passage. But you see, the first scheme is feeling, reflection, then feeling, reflection, and this is mirrored in this other. He speaks of back and forth direction, and then he adds 1 so, 2 why, an apparent given that goes from 3 to 4, and that which is presented in the answer. So I want to interpret now these 2 schematizations. It might come as a surprise that in the first scheme, the terms feeling and reflection are first arranged from left to right and then vice versa, chiastically, and that numbering starts from left to right and the continuous clockwise. The set of keywords from the 2 schemes that follows the same order in the preceding paragraph and the complementary designation of the next sequence of numbers clarify them as follows. According to my ideas. Philosophy begins with a need that appears in consciousness as a feeling, as something that attracts the mind to engage with it, which then leads to the reflection on the need. The result of this reflection is the reflected consciousness on the needy feeling. This in turn leads to a reflected awareness of the reflection itself. Reflection thus turns out to be the unity that first establishes a connection that can only come out through thinking, what Hardenberg, referring to Kant, calls assumed systematic connection. The 2 schemes, as the basis of all philosophizing, as Hardenberg calls it, presented in a condensed and linear form, contain the following aspect, and you'll find this on your handout. This is condensed by myself. First, feeling, an apparent given, so. Second, reflection, then the question why. Feeling, thus, something found in us. And fourth, reflection, therefore, that which is presented in the answer. In Hardenberg's opinion, feeling, because of its non-thetic form, refers above all to the infinite, the absolute, but only becomes conscious or as deprivation in reflection. Hence, feeling is precisely in opposition to reflection, as it is not intentional and not thetic. That is why in the ordo inversus, feeling can be an indicating state referring to the absolute, which apparently becomes conscious in the process of reflection and is then revised in a second reflection. The thoughts on direction of feeling and reflection of freedom and determination are conceived as a moving, swinging back and forth between these 2 moments. Hardenberg understands the relationship as with many things according to the structure of ordo inversus. The systematic connection between feeling and reflection constructed according to the ordo inversus can be understood as the germ and the model of all original productivity through drives occurring in consciousness. Not only the ordo inversus of feeling and reflection is fundamental to Hardenberg's philosophical conception, but also the object's relation, insofar as the object is understood to be partially given to the subject and partially found, or, as it is the case in other contexts, to be invented. The appearance of feeling in consciousness is, according to this scheme, an apparent given. So, The feeling appears as suddenly as the object of intuition. It exists without requiring conscious spontaneity, which usually accompanies thought as soon as the will actively directs its power to contemplation. But the feeling is, as here stated, only an apparent given. The reason obviously lies in the fact that in feeling, the object is given differently compared to intuition. The feeling that originally arrives in a subject state whose content and object are at first completely undetermined. The undetermined state is a so being which dares reflection to ask for the reason, the why of the so being. Reflection examines and scrutinizes the undetermined state of feeling more closely. In reflection, the state of feeling is replaced by the realization of the reason for feeling, namely, thus, something found in us, as he writes. Hardenberg assumes that reflection obtains an answer to the question of a reason. However, he does not elaborate on how it finds this answer. Nevertheless, the feeling certainly indicates that the so is to be found in the subject and that the why, which is a feeling, can be presented in an answer. In the reflection of the feeling, one also learns to understand oneself and one's function in the indispensable interaction with the feeling. This structure is also the basis for the following statement that you found on your handout, the statement Fichte Study number 98. Emergence expresses in its ambiguity the highest philosophical truth, the surrender the I in order to complete itself. Thus, it is clear how, through its emergence, it emerges. It finds itself, outself, itself. In German, it's a very special coining of words, ein Innenfindung. This finding becomes a finding out, a finding in reality, in theoretically determined reality, which is the only one there is for the I. In this paragraph, Hardenberg very densely sums up his philosophical systematic core idea in which finding oneself through reflection is thought of as the origin, genesis, and finally also the completion of the subject as well as of philosophy. Although in the preceding context, there was only talk of finding, here, however, emergence is discussed in its ambiguity. The ambiguity of emergence means, on the one hand, the origin of expressing oneself by means of feeling and reflection, even if feeling is only indirectly addressed. On the other hand, it is understood as an ongoing process of emerging, of coming into being, and is completely in terms of quality by achieving excellence in one's life and in terms of quantity by one's at the end of life. The emergence of something new, something that did not exist before, is, however, not an entirely isolated process. It is at the same time a finding, albeit it is a finding out itself, which Hardenberg calls a finding out, a finding in reality. In the interrelation between emerging as well as finding out and finding in, the close relationship between necessarily given and freely produced is present without going into detail. Although the relationship between feeling and thinking is not explicitly mentioned here, these thoughts are nevertheless systematically based on the order inversus of feeling and reflection. Hardenberg calls the original freedom, which is only open and accessible to feeling, mere being or chaos, in the Fichte study number 3. There he writes, should there be a still higher sphere, it would be the sphere between being and not being, the oscillation between the two, something inexpressible, and here we have the concept of life. Hardenberg calls it tangibleness, highest presentation of the incomprehensible. We often encounter that the order inversus turns into paradoxes in the Fichte studies. Hardenberg seems to truly love that kind of wording. He wants to uncover life and knows that it is ultimately impossible, as he reflects in Fichte study number 3. Not grasping for Hardenberg does not necessarily mean not grasping anything at all, because one can still feel. Feelings and sensations can be captured and held on to. Thinking makes it possible to grasp and analyze them. However, the original character of feeling is destroyed in the process. In the process of destroying what can be grasped is captured and then pinned down in a word. That happens, or seems to happen, in the conceptless judgment of the subject who bases their judgments on feeling. To the end, Hardenberg asked himself towards the end of Fichte study 649 and towards the end of the Fichte studies in general. He speaks here of the touchstone of truth and states, our sensations excludes and includes. In its totality, it is the unconscious intuition of the world of spirit. We sense an objective whole, and with every determination of the faculty of knowledge, we sense a certain right or wrong. What matters to Hardenberg time and again is the origin of the formation of consciousness, because he has realized that thinking draws from the sources that feed it, but he cannot grasp them, and thus gives feeling and sensation their own space within epistemology. This all can be perceived as a dimension of philosophical explorations that is as innovative as it is lively. Creativity is not only one of his major philosophical topics, but with his reflections, his bold trains of thought, and his jumping from thought to thought, Hardenberg himself orchestrates creativity and gives insight into his black box. The alternation between feeling and thinking, which Hardenberg thought to be fundamental, challenges the fully established philosophical rationality that focuses mainly on cognition. Consciousness is intuition and thinking. Consciousness, however, is not limited to that. It is much more. Consciousness allows its cognitive abilities to form higher powers. The space of the comprehensible, which Kant calls the comprehensible, is created and formed. In contrast to Kant, Hardenberg not only wants to show the boundaries of the comprehensible, der vernünftigen Welt, he also wants to know the incomprehensible. Thus, he discovers that the boundaries between these two worlds are not only virtual, but only a line, but that the boundary actually occupies an immense space, namely the space of feeling. Feeling draws attention to itself and is apparent mere being or chaos, as he wrote in Fichte study 3. Determinable relations can be observed. Although there will always be boundaries where the incomprehensible begins, thought always finds ways, guided by feeling and sensation, and makes connections and sheds light on the unconscious intuition of the world of spirit, as Hardenberg wrote in Fichte study 649. Hardenberg's thoughts convey the plasticity of consciousness in an intriguing way, with a tangible and at the same time elusive vividness. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Waibel, for this very intriguing talk. The floor is now open for questions. So to ask a question or to take part in the discussion, please use the raise hand function. In case you have technical difficulties, you can, of course, put your question in the chat. And we have something like 10-15 minutes for discussion. Yes, James Reid, please.
Thank you very much, Violetta, for this rich talk. So just a quick question about how you see Hardenberg on feeling in relation to Fichte. there seem to be quite a few things that you've said today that would be difficult to square with positions that Fichte develops in the Grundlage, for instance. But of course, in the third part, especially, Fichte places quite a high premium on Gefühl as the way in which we encounter our finitude in the real world, in our active engagement with and orientation to it. So if you could just speak in general terms, do you see this as a creative appropriation of Fichte? Do you see aspects of Hardenberg's development of a philosophy of feeling coming into significant conflict with positions that Fichte developed at the time when Hardenberg is engaging with him? What's your thought on that? Thank you.
Thank you very much for this question. Hardenberg goes much more far on with his notion of feeling as everybody of the philosophers at that time, as Kant, as Fichte, and so on. But I don't think that there is really a conflict between what we find on feeling in Fichte and in Novalis. Fichte has a very special idea on feeling, because he speaks of the feeling of the outer world. You remember in the Grundlage of the Wissenschaftslehre of 1794-95, and this goes back to Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi and his discussion with humans. So feeling for Fichte is the boundary that gives information to the eye that there is an outer world, and this is nearly limited, I think, in the early Fichte to this function, and you find at some places exactly this that Novalis picks up in his Fichte studies. Insofar, I don't see a conflict. What you have to see is that the Fichte studies are not very systematic. At one place he says something, another place you can find some expression that says directly the other thing. And what I do is to find out a kind of systematization of what we can ascribe to Fichte regarding what he speaks of feeling and thinking, and this really impressing idea of this interrelation. There he goes much on and makes much more than, as I already said, Fichte did. But I don't see in the core a conflict with Fichte, but much more an enrichment. Fichte is not interested, and Kant is not interested in what are the things that are beyond our reason.
Thank you.
A question by Alexander Knopf.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Violetta, Waibel, for this very interesting talk. I would like to hear a little bit more about the concept of feeling, because I think one of the reasons why the Fichte studies is such a difficult text is that you have a highly developed formal language or formal system by Novalis. This system or this language works with formal figures, like, for example, the Kirsen that you mentioned. And then the problems start when you try to fill all these different concepts with content. So when you ask yourself, okay, what is the feeling that he is talking about? And I always had problems with this original feeling. So actually what I would like to know is, so in this emergence of the consciousness, as far as I understand Hardenberg, and as far as I understood you, the feeling precedes the reflection, and it appears as a form of need, and then the reflection is actually the answer to this need. And this is how the whole process of the Wechselbestimmung, and the relationship between feeling and reflection starts. But already there I have a problem, because I just cannot imagine a need when there is a complete void. I mean, if there is no consciousness, if there is nothing, how can you feel a need if you never had the experience that there is something to need? So you have a feeling into this void, and this is something that I just don't understand. So I was thinking, we have this systematic problem at the beginning of the Fichte studies. That Hardenberg needs an explanation how the consciousness is constituted. But then later he thinks, okay, it doesn't really work. So there is actually no original feeling, and then in the second step, reflection, but they are equi-primordial. So like both are from the very beginning there and interrelated, because there's simply no other way to imagine feeling and reflection.
Thank you very much for this intriguing question. It's a very good question. If we speak of the genesis, of the emergence of consciousness, then we have to ask ourselves, is it the very origin of coming to consciousness, or is it the very origin of coming to consciousness of something? And I would say it's the latter. It's not the first idea that comes to the first sensation, the first feeling that comes to consciousness, and then leads to philosophizing, to reflecting, is not the first moment of having consciousness. This this makes no sense. But it's the idea, and there are many places where, and reflections of Hardenberg, where he asks, what is philosophy? What is philosophizing? And so he wants to know what is philosophizing. And we have to think of a consciousness that is in interaction with the world. And then there comes this moment where philosophizing comes up, and he asks what is the very origin of philosophizing? What brings us to philosophizing? Why do we make this special thing? And we have to see this. As I said before, you find many sentences, phrases that say the one and then the other thing. This is the one thing, but we have to see it's a question for philosophizing. And a very long time I thought, what kind of nonsense with feeling and reflection and so, but then I understood this is very intelligent what he makes here, because we often have things that give us a kind of mood, a feeling, and we don't know what. And the whole Fichte studies along, Hardenberg does not say what is the feeling, but he only speaks of feeling and reflection, of feeling and thinking. Yeah, it's the opposite of thinking, and that is in interaction with thinking. It comes up something. We have a feeling, a mood, or I don't know, and then we don't know why we begin to think, but we do think at one point, and then this feeling is destroyed because it's not a feeling. Then we begin to think, but we can catch back the feeling if we put aside the thinking. And I think this is the process he has in mind. And I, after thinking a while about this, I thought it's really an interesting reflection on this interaction. And what is so interesting to me is most philosophers at his time were not very much interested in feeling. Kant says on feeling something if it is necessary in moral philosophy, but he has no philosophy of feeling, and so you can say that is worked out. But today we have a whole movement that asks what is feeling in philosophy, and for this I think Hardenberg is very modern. He's experimenting with these thoughts and ask himself, how can I answer my question? Because no Kant, no Fichte, no Jacobi gives me the answer to this, what I want to know.
Thank you very much. There's another question by Karin de Boer.
Yes, thanks for this very interesting and intriguing paper. And I must admit that for a beginner like me, it is not very easy to understand what's going on. So maybe my question is partly related to your answer to the preceding question. I was struck by something on the handout that was not discussed at length, namely the idea of a deduction of philosophy at page 3. And so I find this a very interesting element. Yes, that somehow within philosophy we should be able to provide a deduction maybe of the very possibility of philosophy. But for me, it's very difficult to combine this notion of a deduction of philosophy with Hardenberg's emphasis on feeling. Yes, I can somehow see that that human beings are driven to philosophy or to doing philosophy. So maybe there is a kind of emotional engagement in that regard. But even so, that seems to be something very different from providing a deduction of philosophy in philosophical terms. So, well, I don't know if the question makes sense, but there it is.
Thank you very much for this question. I tried to give an answer, but it seems to me I have already given a part of the answer to Alexander Knopf. You can argue with Fichte regarding your question. We have two different standpoints. The one is the philosopher, and he already is philosophizing. And in this state of philosophizing, he Novalis Hardenberg asks himself, why do we philosophize? How could we come to philosophize? And so we cannot do as whether there is no philosophizing, but we look back. It is the same. It's a parallel question, you can say. How do we come to language? If we ask how we come to language, then we already dispose on language and can use it. And this is the same thing with Hardenberg. When he wrote his Fichte studies, he studied intensely the Fichte's Wissenschaftslehre. He studied Kant critique of pure reason and so. And from this dimension, he thinks Fichte makes a deduction of the philosophical world beginning with the I. And his answer is, how do we come to the I? And this is all a question that is put on the level of philosophy that directs its question and its deduction to the very beginning of Urhandlung and stuff like that. when he often speaks of deduction, or sometimes speaks of deduction, but he does not make deductions like Fichte in this systematical way. You can in Fichte found a play of deduction, a play of a language, as I call it, and in Hardenberg, it's you have to have in mind his situation when he philosophizes. He was so much interested in philosophy, but had to make his juridical studies. Then he finished his exam and began to work. And philosophy was so important to him that he takes some hours, 2-3 hours a day, and reflected, reading Fichte and reflecting by his own. This is the way how these Fichte studies came about, and were worked out. And one of his central questions is, what is philosophizing? How do we come to philosophy? And what is the origin of philosophy? Where does come from the need to philosophize? And I think it's a good answer to say, if I construct the very beginning of philosophizing, then it's not here. Then it's something that drives me to it. And there's a feeling that is void and wants to get an answer.
Yeah. May I add something to this question? Perhaps it's not. Pardon?
If it's short, a short
remark.
It's
very short, yeah. But it might be revealing how the concept of deduction was used, because there's a very similar argument in Friedrich Schlegel's notebooks on philology, where he thinks about a deduction of philology. And he says, he takes the word philology in a very literal meaning, that there is the love for the logos. So that's the impulse which creates our interest into texts. And that's for him the reason to deduct philology. So perhaps we have a similar thinking with Hardenberg, which would correspond very, very well to your theory of drives, because then we have this drive of philosophizing, an innate phenomenon which enables us to deduct philosophy.
Thank you.
There are two further questions. I propose that we keep them in mind, so to say, because if I'm looking to the schedule of today, we would end up with a very long session if we give the floor to two other questions. So perhaps after one of the other talks, and also of course during the informal discussion, there will be room for more discussion. So I propose we will start now with the second talk. So the second talk will be given by James Reid. James Reid is Associate Professor of Philosophy at the Metropolitan State University of Denver, where he teaches ethics and the history of philosophy. And his research moves between philosophy, literature, and science, and centers on problems in metaphysics, human nature, and ethical life, and also the history of ancient and 19th and 20th century German philosophy. He has published widely on Heidegger, but also on Kant and Fichte, and he is also the co-editor of a volume on Thoreau. The title of this volume is Thoreau's Importance for Philosophy. And he published a book also on Rilke, Poetry and Philosophy. And he is working on a book on Novalis. Recently, an article of his on Novalis, the title is Novalis Philosophical Fictions, Love, Reason, and the Given, from the Fichte Studies to the Hymns of the Night, So this article was recently published in the European Journal of Philosophy. And the title of his talk today is "The I is Fundamentally Nothing, Hardenberg on I-hood, Philosophy and the Given." Welcome, Professor Reid.
Thank you very much. So let me first just thank Karine for the invitation, and my co-presenters, whom I'm sharing the stage with today, Violetta Waibel and Alexander Knopf, and all of you for being in attendance. So I've argued elsewhere that Novalis endorses a version of the theory of the primacy of practical reason, one that strongly resembles a position developed by Fichte during the period of the Vienna Wissenschaftslehre, and that this commits him to a view of the I as fundamentally active. To this extent, the Fichte Studien appears to have been appropriately named. But Fichte's early philosophy, as it developed between 1794 and 1799, can, I think, be appropriately characterized as a species of egology, according to which the first principle of the entire theory of scientific cognition is an act of absolute self-positing. I refer you, of course, to the first section of the Grundlage. Although the not I plays an important role in Fichte's thought, its positing in the I being the second of three first principles of the doctrine of science, what Fichte has to say about the I's positing of the not I, and his philosophical efforts to defend the importance of feeling in the revelation of what seems to present itself beyond the I, still place the primary accent on the I's transparency in its self-positing activity, as well, of course, as its foundational role in any adequate system of philosophy itself. While the Fichte studies resists the tidy conclusion, there are several notes that call into question, I think, the Fichtean assumption shared by Descartes that mind is sovereign and capable of clarifying itself and its contents in a purely reflective manner. As Novalis himself asks early on, and in a way that anticipates several trains of thought to follow, this is quote number one, has not Fichte too arbitrarily packed everything into the I, and with what warrant? We have then, I think, to ask what, if anything, can be said about the source of the contents of the morally oriented mind and philosophy's relation to what passes for the given. If freedom and the moral point of view are central to any adequate vision of the world, I think they are for Novalis, we can also ask what role the everyday sense of a world of things that seem to impose themselves upon a receptive mind ought to play in the articulation of a vision of the human condition. Our freedom is not unrestricted, Fichte would admit as much, but hedged in by the givens that impose themselves upon a mind uncertain at times about where the world ends and where its freedom begins, and uncertain about how far the world can be said to sustain our practical commitments. In the words of my friend Richard Eldridge, we must somehow come to see the world as supporting the actualization of freedom. Hardenberg's position on the given appears in some respects to be Kantian or Fichtean in spirit, in keeping with his insistence upon the importance of freedom, activity, and spontaneity, especially the spontaneity of the imagination. Hardenberg repeatedly insists that mind is ever active, that objectivity and meaning do not impose themselves upon a passive mind, and that, drawing from the Kant Studien, we know something only insofar as we realize it, perhaps even to create it in some sense. The world certainly doesn't tell us how to interpret it. What and how it is, its very being, cannot, of course, be divorced from the ways we decide or discover to take it up. If the world is always already speaking to us, it is because we are always speaking about and acting within it. Meaning is there for us in some sense because reality wears a human face. In the very first note that opens the Fichte Studien, Hardenberg observes, in connection with the first principle of the Wissenschaftslehre, the sphere of the I must encompass everything for us. As its self-content, it can recognize or know, erkennen, content. But the drift of these notes frequently moves in a direction difficult to square with Kantian and Fichtean orthodoxy, and especially, I think, on the topic of feeling. It is important to recall that Fichte's early philosophy places a heavy premium on feeling as the primary way in which the human mind discovers itself to be limited. But it is possible to interpret the Fichte Studien as a sustained polemic against the perceived formalism of the philosophies of Kant and Fichte, where the unity of the I is the essential fact or fact-act Tathandlung that absorbs all content into itself. Still, just to be careful here, we should avoid saddling Fichte with positions he doesn't embrace. At times, Hardenberg seems to make claims that appear to be criticisms of Fichte that turn out to be restatements of positions that Fichte himself endorses. In note 3, for example, he asks, can an I posit itself as I without another I or not I? And the answer for Fichte himself is clearly no. The reality of the world is formed by concrete relations between the I, the not I, and a community of human subjects, working themselves out in spaces of what we might call possible mutual recognition. The matter at issue throughout most of the second part of the Grundlage concerns how to conceptualize the relationship between I and not I. But that project clearly presupposes that the not I, or at least its positing, is a necessary condition of self-consciousness itself, which Fichte insists time and again is invariably finite. And what some perceive as one of Hardenberg's most provocative criticisms of Fichte, that the absolute I is in the end merely a regulative idea, postulated, as Novalis observes in note 41, is again precisely the position to which the line of thought worked out in the Grundlage leads. But Hardenberg places a heavy burden upon feeling that the Fichtean philosopher might find a difficult pill to swallow, suggesting that our moral engagement and activity require, and I think this picks up on what Violetta Waibel was saying, a kind of felt orientation in background conditions that are irreducible to transparent acts of self-positing subjectivity. Our moral activity might be more like the work of responding to complex relations into which we find ourselves thrown, anchored in the obscurity of feeling and without the prospect that I think Fichte relishes in the long run of complete transparency. We can locate what appears, I think, to be a genuine quarrel with Fichte and Kant as well in several remarks scattered throughout the Fichte Studien concerning the I, feeling, passivity, and the status of the given. In a remarkable note, this is 98, in the first group, Hardenberg insists, this is quote number 2, that the I finds itself outside itself, again, picking up on Violetta. This finding becomes a finding out, a finding in reality. And the I from this standpoint is empirical, even as a capacity for freedom and morality. This is quote 3. Freedom and morality are characteristic only of the empirical I, Novalis writes. The I is only an empirical concept. How to square this with some other things that he says about the I, we could perhaps talk about in our discussion. This bare announcement receives more sustained treatment in the second group of notes, where it appears to move in an even further un-Fichtean direction. In 234, for instance, he touches on the alleged purity of the I. This is quote number 4. The concept pure is an empty concept, one to which no intuition corresponds, a concept that is neither possible nor actual nor necessary. Everything pure is thus a deception of the imagination, a necessary fiction. And I'll just point out here that one of Fichte's more original departures from Kant is his insistence that the pure I's self-positing activity is revealed to itself in a case of intellectual intuition. Although Hardenberg will go on to produce his own philosophical fictions, the context of this remark, I think, suggests that the appeal to fiction here is somewhat questionable, even if philosophically unavoidable or intellectually necessary. The fictions of his idealistic contemporaries seem to leave something to be desired. Our concrete relations to persons and things have been impoverished in extant philosophical discussions. Of course, Novalis has his own philosophical fictions eventually to offer that mean, I think, to enrich our sense of what the world itself has to give, but they are anchored in the felt qualities of being thrown into a world not entirely of our own making, and resistant to our ongoing efforts to reduce them to acts of the acting and thinking mind. In some respects, the conception here evolves out of an analysis of what we might call intentionality in the phenomenological sense, and in a sense more robust, I think, than Manfred Frank's insistence that, quoting, reference to an object is essential to Novalis's view of knowledge. For the requirement that the I relate itself to something other than itself is not merely a condition necessary for the possibility of objective cognition. I think this is almost a truism, that cognition of objects requires a relation to objects about which judgments can be made, but one that touches on the very being of the I itself. Several notes running throughout the Fichte Studien affirm the necessity of the I's relation to something other than itself in order to be an I at all and to grasp itself as such. Quote, in order to determine the I, we must relate it to something. Further along in the same note, this is number 3, but with a strikingly social modification, in order to conceive itself, the I must represent to itself another like itself. And in a move that might be difficult for Fichte to accept, at least in the form that it assumes here, Hardenberg insists, and this is quote number 5 on the handout, that the I's original act of self-positing must be connected with the antithesis of an independent, not I, and related to a sphere that encompasses them. As Novalis tersely observes, for the pure I alone, there is nothing. The I actualizes itself only in relation to nature and other minds. Insofar as we are actual, we are nature, he says. Everything actual belongs to nature. The categories themselves on this view are, quote, compartments without content. They want to be filled. They are nothing without content. They have a drive to be, consequently to have content, because they exist actually only insofar as they have it. And in the final note in group 5, this is number 6, the I, which gives my talk its title today, is said to be fundamentally nothing. Everything must be given to it. Of course, this is a well-known Kantian position, the I of transcendental apperception being the mere form of unity, content being supplied, of course, by Sinnlichkeit, sensibility. What remains on this view for the I to do is the work of what we might call appropriating content that comes into our fields of vision and action from someplace else. Our moral agency then requires sustaining sources, background conditions, and contexts that cannot be made over in an image of free self-positing. And I think in the long run, absolutely free self-activity is not even viewed for Hardenberg as the goal of our moral striving, even as an infinite task. The better life emerges by allowing the given to show up in the thickness that comes from what I'll risk calling our loving or erotic investments. And of course, I mean erotic in a very broad sense. And to take it up in the philosophical elucidations of the conditions of any meaningful life. Such passages, I think, speak strongly against Molnar's insistence that for Novalis, everything is essentially a product of the self's activity. I'm quoting him here. And to comprehend any phenomenon correctly simply means being able to behold it in this context. But against Beiser, I don't think such remarks provide convincing evidence of some variety of realism. If by realism we mean something like the view that the real transcends our sense-making capacities altogether. In some respects, his thought might be seen in anticipation of Heidegger as an effort to overcome the very standpoint that generates the conflict between realism and idealism in the first place, one in which we have to choose between an independent subject or an independent object as the explanatory basis of human experience, a move that Fichte himself frequently makes, right? Fundamental choice between starting with an independent subject, which of course for Fichte is the right way to go, or assuming the existence of an independent object. And Fichte thinks that we're never going to get subjectivity out of the starting point that begins with an independent object. In note 374, he complains, I love this quote, the question of idealism and realism is stupid. And the stupidity itself seems to consist in the very ambition of the idealist to locate ultimate sources of significance in the self-positing I, beyond the more modest task of finding the given to be meaningful and then appropriating it in more discursive fashion. And the realist's equally quixotic effort to reduce the self-interpreting gestures of the empirical and finite I to mere givens on the part of an independent reality. Givens are never merely given, are nothing like the brute data that serve as starting points in empiricist analyses of human cognition. The felt, what I'm calling the felt contexts of significance within which our tasks emerge, that make whatever ends it makes sense to pursue at least minimally intelligible, are the very conditions of whatever activity we are capable of that shapes our ongoing moral practices. Several notes draw attention to the various ways in which passivity and the given are, of course, enabled by our sense-making activities. If the I can never be obtained from itself, that's a quote, it does not follow, of course, that mental activity has nothing to do. As I noted above, Hardenberg never wavers in his commitment to the importance of freedom and self-activity under some description. I think it would be closer to the spirit of the Fichte Studien to say that feeling, which Hardenberg associates with the most basic form of being given, makes possible thought and reflection in what we might call a state of action and passion at once. The passivity characteristic of perception is explicitly said to be a case of active receptivity. And some of the boldest and most interesting lines of thought, at least from my perspective, developed sporadically in the Fichte Studien, concern the complex relations between activity and passivity in human life, consciousness, the constitution of an objective world, and the possibility of our knowledge of nature. The stance emerging in the notes comes perhaps to clearest expression in the final note in group 5. This is quote number 7 on the handout. The I cannot deduce from itself what is not given to it, but with something's being given comes also the I's warrant and power to deduce it. What is given to the I belongs to it for eternity, because the I is nothing but the principle of appropriation. This has, I think, important consequences for the very idea of philosophy itself. And here I think Novalis comes really close to a parting of the ways with both Kant and Fichte, despite Manfred Frank's otherwise convincing attempt, at least in my view, to make Novalis over at times in an image of Kantian critical philosophy. For both Kant and Fichte, philosophy is genuinely autonomous. It poses problems of its own or reason's making, and its solutions involve the free articulation and defense of reason's own principles and laws. Kant himself notes in the 3rd section of the Grundlegung, this is 448 in the Gesamtschriften pagination. Sorry, I just lost my, where am I? There I am. That the very idea of a reason guided or influenced from without is an absurdity. Hardenberg explicitly affirms, by contrast, that not only feeling but understanding and reason themselves are in a way passive. Such a strange thing to say, especially in relation to his predecessors. Of course, he might be echoing Jacobi's suggestion that reason is not a faculty of inference, but a mode of perception. But Fichte too, of course, speaks of a feeling of ought, a mode of access to the moral law that Kant, despite the doctrine of Achtung, would have found questionable in the Wissenschaftslehre Nova Methode. As I noted in my introductory remarks, the Fichte Studien reveals an abiding interest in how philosophy itself gets started, what philosophical knowledge presupposes, and how philosophy relates to pre-philosophical experience. And the notes reveal here a decidedly un-Kantian strain. This is quote number 8. Philosophy should not answer more than it is asked. It can generate nothing. Something must be given to it. In the same note, he makes the startling claim that philosophy itself is originally feeling. I'm still not quite sure what to make of that. What this means is at least spelled out briefly in several important fragments from the 4th group. This is quote number 9. All philosophy is only the explanation of that which is there, the putting together of that which belongs together, the separating of that which is different, exhibition of the pure thing of true relation, of actual change, end quote. The work of philosophy is discursive, a way of putting things in order. This is quote number 10. All of the theory must be given completely. Philosophy can do nothing but order. And it rests upon a distinctive sort of feeling. Another quote, the pure feeling of the nature of the thing, what is called healthy human understanding, is indispensable even to the scholar, the scientific architect. and the primary mode of feeling, as I anticipated above, relevant at once to philosophy and the task of living well, is love. So moving just briefly outside of the context of the Fichte Studien, writing to Friedrich Schlegel on 8 July 1796, Novalis expresses sympathy with Spinoza and Zinzendorf, both of whom understood, quote, the infinite idea of love, and expresses also the regret that, quote, I see nothing of this perspective, Aussicht, in Fichte, feel nothing of this creative breath. That's Novalis Schriften, Band 4, page 188, for those who wish to track that reference. The chief quarrel with Fichte, to the extent that this can be discerned in these notes, is anchored, I think, in how Hardenberg's predecessor interprets the sources of the given for the interpreting I. Fichte, at the end of the day, I still think has a story to tell about the importance of overcoming the given in acts of self-positing, free acts of self-positing. And this turns out, at least on one construal, to involve a kind of backstory. Bit of a caricature here, but I'll risk it, according to which the absolute I somehow freely constructs the given. Hardenberg has a more modest story, I think, to tell about how things show up for us and challenge us to make sense of the given and what gives, whatever that turns out to be. And it isn't obvious, at least to Novalis, that everything given should be made over in an image of absolute freedom. The emptiness of the pure I as demand for form, order, coherence, I take to be more of an invitation on the part of the creative individual to bring the objects of its feeling, love, to more coherent expression. Early reflections on the possibility of consciousness, self-consciousness, and judgment tend then toward the loving or feeling background of our becoming conscious in the first place and finding things worth judging about. This I take to be one of the more settled convictions that shakes out of Novalis's early engagement with the Wissenschaftslehre, and it shapes so much of the philosopher-poet's activity in the ensuing years of his short life. As I hope to show down the road in the monograph that I'm working on, from which some of this has been taken, this insistence on the background conditions of our having world at all is central to the design of the Human an die Nacht, which reveals lines of continuity, in my view, with the Fichte Studien. Already in the more discursive setting here, Novalis speaks of the unknown, das Unbekannte, the source of all that is and is capable of analysis and synthesis as das heilige Nichts, the holy nothing, which we might gloss, again looking way ahead, as the dark soil or the night out of which all things emerge. The hymns might be said to give mature poetic expression to Hardenberg's youthful sense of the mysterious source of all things, one that can't be divorced from his earliest extant philosophical reflections, where the I is charged with the task of fashioning images and signs that gesture toward origins and ends, but in a way that keeps the ground of being somewhat elusive. Indeed, one might go so far as to say that the I that emerges throughout these notes is fundamentally an image-making freedom. Selves are constituted identities fashioned through something like aesthetic activity. If the source of the given remains unknown, it falls to our symbolic and imaginative activity, what Novalis sometimes simply calls Bildungskraft, to tell us what it might be like. But working all of this out, of course, falls to another occasion. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thanks a lot, James, for this, for another fascinating talk. And I see that immediately two participants want to ask questions. The first one is Gabe oder Gabe Gottlieb.
Hi, Gabe. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. So the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for that. That was very interesting. So I guess I really have two questions. They're both relatively straightforward, I think. The first is about fictions and the sort of more maybe historical question about the sense in which that's being used, as you were discussing at the head of the paper. And I'm wondering to what extent this concept of fiction is connected to the way in which someone like Maimon is employing the concept of fiction. So that's the first question. And the second is about Novalis's construal of the Fichtean I and sort of some of the ways in which he seems to talk about it. The question is really whether, and I'll preface it by saying this, one of the concerns that Fichte has of the way in which Kantians at the time were talking about Kant is he seems to think that many of them are treating categories as if they're kind of containers in which you stuff things in. And so he wants to say that the categories are really acts or activities of the mind. And so I wonder if there's a similar kind of concern one might have about the ways in which Novalis is not treating the categories maybe, but treating the Fichtean I. If there's some sense in which it starts to look a little bit like a container rather than a kind of activity.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Gabe. I mean, I think the question concerning Novalis's relation to Maimon is an important one. I haven't thought through it sufficiently to be able to say much about it, but certainly Maimon has a certain view, right, according to which the recourse to fictions in some sense is philosophically inescapable. And certainly, you know, Novalis seems to be pretty wholeheartedly committed to that, not of course as something to lament, but as something to be recognized and celebrated as a way in which we might think about how philosophy itself gets started. That worry about the categories, I think that's right. I mean, in some respects, Novalis seems to share with the Kantians that Fichte is criticizing, this view that the categories are just static conceptual containers within which content gets somehow stuffed, or containers, to change the metaphor a bit, containers according to which we just organize something that comes into our conceptual field from someplace else. Whether that's an adequate way of understanding the categories or not, I leave open to question, but certainly that seems to be the position that Novalis himself is prepared, in some notes at least, to embrace. And of course, it's this notion that, I tend to think that at the end of the day, at least in the Fichte Studien, there's really only one active power, and it's Einbildungskraft, right? So I think he even has an understanding of reason. This comes out quite clearly in note 212 that comes close to opening the second set of notes. Even reason itself is just a kind of static repository, say, of ideas, according to which we might interpret the things that we find ourselves relating to in a world of givenness, in a way that would be nearly impossible to square with either Kant or Fichte. I mean, Fichte on a number of occasions is quite clear that he shares with Kant the notion that reason just is fundamentally active. The notion of a passive reason is just countersensical, right? An absurdity, an unding. So I don't know if that helps. It's at least a start, but thank you so much, Gabe. That was good. Good starting point for sure.
Yeah, thank you for the reply. There was another question, but I don't see the hand anymore. So perhaps that person still wants to ask the question or withdrew. And I didn't have the time to write down the name. So, well, then Pavel Reichel.
Thanks very much, Henny, and thanks for that talk. So I just have a question about a clarificatory question about something you mentioned at the beginning, the thesis of the primacy of practical reason. Yeah. So I think at the beginning you said that Novalis accepts the thesis of the primacy of practical reason that was asserted by, and then I thought you were going to say Kant in the second critique in 1788 or whenever it was, but you said by Fichte in, what was it, 94 in the Wissenschaftslehre, or later than that. So so I guess there are three versions of this thesis of the primacy of practical reason. I guess I just wanted to ask what it means actually, and what the differences are between them, because I can't make, I think I don't understand the Kantian one. I'm not sure if it makes sense. I don't know the Novalis one and the Fichte somewhere in between. So if you could say something perhaps about.
Yeah, I can. So I think Dan Brazil has done a really good job of drawing attention to just how many ways the primacy thesis can be understood. Keeping things as simple as I can, my sense of the Kantian position in the second critique, it has less to do with something structural, and maybe some might wish to push back on me on this, but it's more about what he calls the interests of reason, right? The primacy thesis doesn't, at least in the form that we find it there in the second critique, doesn't involve some sort of structural claim about the human subjects being fundamentally practical. In fact, there are certain things that Kant says in other contexts that make it sound as though the theoretical and the practical points of view have a kind of Gleichursprünglichkeit about them, an equiprimordiality. And it's only in certain contexts that, of course, end up generating some controversial views about postulates, God, immortality, and the like, where Kant is prepared to say that at least in terms of the things that human reasoners are interested in, we should let practical concerns take the lead. I think that Fichte, to the degree to which I understand him, is moving more in the direction of a kind of structural point about the fundamentally practical or active nature of the I, out of which certain theoretical concerns might be said to issue. And whether I'm right about that in relation to Fichte or not, I think that's a position that Novalis comes pretty close to defending in a few notes in the Fichte Studien themselves. So I don't know if that's, to start, helpful.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Perhaps one other question. Well, we can take both questions that were still had to be asked after Violetta Waibel's talk. We can take them at the end. And so I propose we go now to the third talk. The third talk will be given by Alexander Knopf. Alexander Knopf is a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of English, Germanic and Romance Studies of the University of Copenhagen. He has not only published many articles on Friedrich Schlegel and on Friedrich von Hardenberg, so our author of today, but also an article on Kant that I think may be relevant in this context, since the title is Kants transzendentale Begründung des Gefühls. His research on literature comprises articles on Alexander Kluge, on Peter Weiss, Ästhetik des Widerstandes, and Frank Witzel. The title of his talk today is Tower of Babel, Transcendental Linguistics in Friedrich von Hardenberg's Fichte Studies. So please join me in welcoming Alexander Knopf.
Yeah, thank you very much for this introduction and this kind invitation. Can you hear me? Is it okay? Yeah. Just let me say two quick things before I start. I want to thank you for this invitation, but there goes special thanks to Augustin Dumont. I don't know if he's here today, but I was invited due to his recommendation of my work to you. So I'm very indebted to him that I can be here today. I'm very happy with that. I hope you are as well, because actually Augustin should have been here today. And then the second thing I want to say is that I realized that I promised a little bit too much in my abstract. I cannot present a full interpretation of the linguistic dimension of the Fichte studies today. I will try to provide some elements, but if you are interested in a full account of my ideas, you will find a published article, open access, under the very same title as my talk today bears. Okay, I start. In this talk, I will try to give an idea of the linguistic dimension of Hardenberg's Fichte studies. I will argue that it was one of Hardenberg's principal aims to develop a transcendental language that is, a universally valid language applicable to transcendental philosophy. His attempt, and it is not more than that, has to be situated in a discussion that was provoked by Kant's critique of pure reason. Kant had claimed that the system of transcendental knowledge could be set out in a system of pure concepts of understanding containing the totality of rules and functions according to which the mind is able to process the sensuously given manifold. As such, Kant's system of concepts is not only the precondition for any possible experience, but also indifferent to its designation. The categories as well as the concepts derived from them are prior to any sign. In fact, they are supposed to organize the use of our language. Although all transcendental knowledge was assumed to be necessary and universally true, by which Kant hoped to lay out the foundations for an eternal peace within the discipline of philosophy, the scientific community fell quickly apart as a result of their different interpretations of the first critique. As Carl Leonhard Reinhold observed, the system of transcendental knowledge is communicated through concepts and expressions which themselves do not belong to the system. Several basic positions or basic concepts such as experience, intuition, object, representation, necessity, relation, or even the concept of concept were only supposed by Kant and not defined or sufficiently determined, according to Reinhold. Since their meaning depends entirely on the context, every reader was free to understand the critique according to his or her own philosophical principles. Provided that the criterion for all objective knowledge is universal communicability, as Kant himself maintained, then transcendental philosophy had to find an appropriate language in order to make universally valid propositions. And this is the very background of Hardenberg's famous note, which we find right at the beginning of Mehl's edition, Theory of the Sign, What Can Be True Through the Medium of Language. First quote on the handout. But if all our knowledge is mediated, the problem of language cannot be simply added to all the other problems unfolded in the text. Since we have to understand the process of mediation first, all other arguments are embraced by the problem of language. From this perspective, Hardenberg's critical attention to the linguistic properties of single concepts, permanently accompanying his own formulations, appears in a new light, much like the many attempts with which he is testing the applicability of different combinations of concepts for the same or at least similar issues. Both methods would serve the very specific purposes of clearing the philosophical terminology from ambiguity and arbitrariness on the one side, and to separate the transcendental sign determined by its necessary relation to the signified from conventional and ordinary words on the other. Thus, in the Fichte studies, the material side of language becomes a matter of transcendental philosophy from which it had been excluded by Kant, Fichte, and Reinhold. But there's another reason why Hardenberg's idea of a transcendental language cannot be easily regarded as one argument among others. The Fichte studies does not contain a consistent linguistic theory. Instead, the text shows us how the full dimension of the problem reveals itself gradually to Hardenberg, thus repeatedly forcing him to modify his ideas about it. Hardenberg's thinking on language is in constant movement, proceeding tentatively and correcting itself whenever it turns out to be unavoidable. In this talk, therefore, I will try to make some remarks about the intricate development of this thinking. Due to the time limit, I will have to concentrate on certain aspects and leave others aside. I've chosen the concept of representation, Vorstellung in German, which is, in my opinion, crucial to the Fichte studies. It is one of the major issues that Hardenberg was unable to resolve. by pursuing this notion, we will also be able to shed some light on Hardenberg's linguistic ideas. I shall begin with Hardenberg's theory of the sign. Hardenberg is convinced that every being appears under the determinate form of a sign, which is in relation to the being and not being, a mere substitute. Without the sign, we would have no being. Consequently, only by elucidating the relationship between sign and signified can we know what can be true through the medium of language. As he will have quickly noticed, Fichte's On the Linguistic Capacity and the Origin of Language from 1795 does not help very much in clarifying the problem of communicability. In Fichte's view, thought is independent of any language. Ideas and concepts already existed when man decided to designate them. Hardenberg will have read with astonishment that the eye's freedom, which is supposed to be absolute in terms of its self-activity, does not even allow for generating the signs needed for communication. Already, the first remarks of his own theory of the sign declare the opposite. Next quote, "The signified is a free effect, likewise the sign." This fundamental freedom, however, collides with the principle of necessity ruling every communicative process. Signs have to be objectively and subjectively necessary. Otherwise, the successful outcome of communication could only be an accident or a miracle. The freedom of the signifying agent is limited by the purpose of making him or herself comprehensible to an alien being. The necessity to which the signifying agent finds himself bound results subjectively from the intersubjective relationship mediated by signs and objectively from the relationship between the sign and the signified. In every communicative relationship, there must be a common ground of relation, Beziehungsgrund, which enables the first signifying agent to choose a generally comprehensible sign and allows the second signifying agent to find the signified designated by the sign. This ground of relation is called schema. Next quote, "Every comprehensible sign must therefore stand in a schematic relationship to the signified." End quote. According to Hardenberg's definition of the schema, both sign and signified are equally primordial. The sign is just the other side of the signified. One does not exist without the other. Thesis and antithesis are united in the synthesis. Such a conception is undeniably attractive, although it leaves open how such a complex act of positing can be performed. It seems particularly modern in the way of binding signifiant and signifié together. It already points to the inseparable unity of material sign and intellectual meaning discovered by Humboldt some years later, and which Saussure compared to two sides of one sheet of paper. However, in his theory of the sign, Hardenberg does not mention any kind of freedom which is related to the signified. The freedom of the signifying agents consists of no more than two moments. The first moment seems to be drawn from Fichte's theory of interpersonality. Both signifying agents are free in their will to communicate with each other. The other moment of freedom is the freedom of choice in terms of the sign. These assumptions are problematic in many respects. The necessity of the schema, for example, contradicts the freedom of choice. Here, I just want to draw your attention to the fact that Hardenberg does not take the signified into consideration. I'm talking about the theory of the sign that he is developing at the very beginning of the Fichte studies. So when I say that he does not take the signified in consideration, it is in this theory of the sign. Surprisingly, Hardenberg's theory does not specify the term designified. According to the majority of Enlightenment theories of language, every sign refers to a representation, a Vorstellung, which is then designified. It is very likely that at this early stage of Hardenberg's thinking, the concept of representation did not appear to require further investigation, as he takes it simply as an image. On various occasions in the Fichte studies, the image is closely connected to the sign. Manfred Frank and Gerhard Kurz famously pointed out that the image is produced ordine inverso. We have heard about that today as well. Hardenberg understands reflection literally as an inversed mirror image of the original object. But even as such, the image would be, just as every Kantian intuition, a pre-established mental entity ready to be designated. The representation would be given rather than being a free effect. But such an image theory neglects the conceptual side of representations. As Kant has argued, there are two kinds of representations, intuitions and concepts. Hardenberg seems to have this distinction in mind when he writes. Next quote. Intuition, representation of intuition. There is no more. To be sure, the last is divided. Everything that corresponds to the object and the subject, or the object in general, is intuition. The subject is representation. The felt, thought intuition, the reception of it is representation. End quote. Apparently, this comes close to Kant's dualisms of phenomenon and thing in itself on one hand, and of intuition and concept on the other. Yet, it is not identical with Kant. Hardenberg takes up the dichotomy of sensuousness and understanding as the two sources of all possible cognition. All representations are preformed by feeling and thought and belong as such to the subject. But the object is no nomenon. The concept of intuition always implies one who is intuiting, anschauend, and that which is intuited, angeschaut. The object intrudes into the sphere of the subject. It defines a sphere of its own upon which the subject has no influence. The subject is free only in the realm of representations. The intuitions, in contrast, are not free. Here the question arises as to how the subject can have knowledge of something other than a representation if, with respect to the subject, nothing else exists than representations. It is here that the imagination comes into play. Intuition and representation are no longer two separate spheres interfering with each other, but rather two sides of one and the same imagination. Next quote. There's only imagination, feeling and understanding. Intuition and representation are just the names given to feeling and imagination together, and concept and imagination together. End quote. The object seems to have vanished from this interrelationship. The I is enclosed in itself. Into this sphere of the I, characterized by a specific lack of being, Hardenberg now introduces the concept of design. Next quote. An image is a represented intuition. A sign is an intuited representation. End quote. The chiastic figure that we have here again, employed in this context, preserves and destroys the dualism of intuition and representation at the same time. On one hand, it seems quite clear that Hardenberg treats the image as a representation and the sign as an intuition. But on the other, the specific difference between both gets blurred. The image would be a representation because it lacks, as a purely mental entity, all materiality. The sign, in turn, would be an intuition because it is sensuously perceivable. Here, the difference between representation and intuition apparently reflects the one between matter and mind. but this difference is not identical with the one between sensuousness and understanding. According to this last dichotomy, the image representation is no concept, but an intuition itself. According to the dualism of intuition and concept, both image and sign belong to the realm of intuitions. Moreover, the intuition that Hardenberg refers to is substituted while passing from one proposition to the other, although this is not made explicit. The term image refers to an intuited object. So does the term sign, but now the object is the sign itself, and the sign is produced, not given. Otherwise, the subject would have a representation of the sign too. According to the dualism of mind and matter, hence, the sign would be representation or mind and intuition or matter at once. Here the difference suddenly appears as one between freedom and necessity, or in Kantian terms, as spontaneity and receptivity. The image is a given representation, the sign a produced intuition. It turns out that in Hardenberg's seemingly simple chiasm, at least 3 different layers are inextricably intertwined. As a mediator between intuition and representation, the imagination operates with necessity. The faculty of representation, by contrast, is identified with the realm of possibility, and the faculty of intuition with the realm of existence, Wirklichkeit. Here we have the 3 modes of existence, Notwendigkeit, Möglichkeit, and Wirklichkeit. Although all possible modes of being are thereby exhausted, existence is itself supposed to be a product of imagination. Representation, says Hardenberg, is thesis. Intuition, a mere relational concept, is antithesis. Next quote, necessary is grounded in imagination and is the synthesis. Possible is a twofold relation in the third. It is nothing but a hovering and schweben between necessary and existent. The laws, end quote, the laws determining the actions of the imagination are provided by reason. But what are the laws according to which the imagination fixates the possible as something existent? In Fichte's foundation of the entire science of knowledge, the imagination oscillates between the 2 poles I and not I, uniting both in a single conscious intuition. This intuition is identified as real by the I. In fact, there's no other reality for the I than the one produced by the imagination. This reality is, as Fichte puts it, no illusion but truth, and the only possible truth. Hardenberg agrees with Fichte that all reality emerges from imagination. However, imagination produces both truth and illusion. Moreover, both are necessary. Even illusion is understood as a necessary fiction. As a necessary fiction, that I have to emphasize the necessary. Illusion is defined as a determination that contradicts the being of the thing. Truth, consequently, is a determination that does not contradict the being of the thing. Hardenberg does not say how the I acquires the knowledge on the basis of which it recognizes the thing and its determinations. For the I, nothing else exists than intuitions and representations, and both are products of the imagination. So are truth and illusion, which makes it, again, incomprehensible how they can be distinguished at all. Is there a point beyond imagination from where the I could make judgments about that? All thought, writes Hardenberg, is thus an art of illusion. This proposition refers to mere thoughts, such as representations without corresponding intuitions, form without material, Stoff, mind without matter. Without any empirical substratum, the imagination produces empty concepts, such as the concept pure. We have heard about that in James' talk. Now, all transcendental concepts are pure by definition. Consequently, transcendental philosophy must be an illusion. But if even these illusions are generated according to the laws of reason, if they are necessary fictions, how can they be distinguished from truth? Hardenberg, in fact, does not oppose them as strictly as one might assume. He compares them with two halves composing a wholeness. And you will find the next quotes on the handout again. Illusion and truth together constitute only one proper reality. This is the reality which the eye is capable of experiencing. The unknown reality, in contrast, is improper. Next quote, reality knows reality only through relation, form, illusion, negation. End quote. Hence, the real illusion is a prerequisite for the true reality. Illusion is the only ground for all form and all material. That was another quote by Hardenberg. In this context, language is defined as material and formal illusion. In doing so, the former specification of the relationship between sign and image is modified again. The sign is still regarded as matter or intuition, respectively, just as the image is regarded as form or representation. But just as both, according to the dualism of intuition and concept, belong to the realm of intuition, they now belong, according to the dualism of truth and illusion, to the realm of representation. Accordingly, the question, this is a question, this is another quote by Hardenberg, what kind of mental image, Gedankenbild, can language give of nature, is indirectly answered by the following question: should all philosophy therefore have to be necessarily one-sided? Philosophy must be one-sided indeed. It must remain in the realm of mere thought, because language cannot give any appropriate representation of nature. This reflection vaguely recalls Kant's verdict that philosophy is doomed to fiddle around in nature. Yeah, Kant says, herumpfuschen in der Natur, in the Critique of Pure Reason. Yet there must be an affinity between language and thought which makes philosophy, albeit one-sided, possible. As both language and thought belong to the realm of illusion, they are finally cut off from reality. Next quote, representation, genus, concepts in general are nothing real. They have only an ideal use. Hence also I, etc. is a regulative idea. The whole philosophy is only a science of reason, only of regulative use, exclusively ideal, without the slightest reality in the proper sense. With the following remark, the Fichte studies takes a new direction. Quote, one cannot say the proposition posits itself, the object posits itself mediately through positing in opposition. But positing and positing in opposition are one. Here the freedom of spirit entangles it in apparent contradictions. The concept of activity already contains merely the data of the concepts, positing, positing in opposition, emerging. All concepts of movement, all verbs in the most authentic sense, words embody the transitus upon which everything rests. Hardenberg uses the term transitus to denote the movement or passage between two opposites, such as from being to not being, or in this quote, from object, Gegenstand, to opposite, Gegensatz. But now this transitus is no longer related to the efficacy of the imagination as it had been before. Rather, it is contained in the words themselves. For Hardenberg, the concept object, Gegenstand, emerges from the verb emerge, entstehen, just as the concept opposite, Gegensatz, emerges from the verbs posit, setzen, and posit in opposition, gegensetzen. Next quote. With respect to the opposite, it can be said it is posited. With respect to the object, it emerges. To emerge expresses self-emergence, a causality which is causality for itself, a passivity through its own activity. End quote. These considerations point to the insight that the transitus is not merely a passing from one side to the other, but additionally a carrying over, a transfer, metaphora, and that therefore, even in transcendental philosophy, the mind is not allowed to set itself in contradiction to the truth of language. Consequently, verb, subject, and predicate or noun and adjective are put in place of representation, consciousness, subject, or object as actual materials of the Elementarphilosophie. This is an implicit quote from Hardenberg. It should have been on a handout, I think, because it's a very important quote. From now on, all notes rest more or less strictly upon two preconditions. Firstly, there is nothing for the eye outside its own consciousness. The eye must have or possess what it wants to discern. The essence of a thing is no longer concealed behind, but revealed through the appearance. The law of the object and the law of the concept must be one and the same, since we only know what is, and there is only what we know. Even we ourselves only are insofar as we know ourselves. The eye is fundamentally nothing, everything must be given to it, but despite the fact that everything must be given to it, the given becomes something only through the eye. The eye is not an encyclopedia, but rather a universal principle. The second precondition is closely connected to the first one. In the relationship between representation and presentation, priority is now given to the latter. Representing something is no longer conceived as an act. There's a neutral verb. The word to represent does not qualify as a generic word for the product of thought. A representation is either a reproduction of a form or an arbitrarily posited being for another thing. Presentability, Darstellbarkeit, in turn, advances to be the criterion of possibility of all philosophy. These are Hardenberg's words. There is no room for doubt that presentability now refers to the production of signs, in particular of spoken and written language. At the end of the Fichte studies, presentation is related to intuition. And intuition is produced when the outer object changes in and through the eye with the concept. As an inner object, the intuition then changes again in and through the eye with the body appropriate to it, and the sign arises. The supposed division into intuition and representation from the beginning of the Fichte studies is withdrawn here. Hardenberg does no longer conceive the intuition as a freely produced image, but rather as the outer object itself. Instead, freedom is shifted to the realm of presentation. The given object may only be, this is all like quote now at the end, the given object may only be the germ, der Keim, the type, the fixed point in and through which the formative power or power of presenting develops. It should determine the eye not as mere object, but rather as product of the eye, emerging from an act of free presenting. If the eye posits itself as a perpetually presenting eye, it thus posits itself as a free, as a determinate presenting eye. And that's the end. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much again for a very interesting paper. We go directly to the questions. Karin has a question.
Yes, thanks for this. So I have a more general question, because, you know, while listening to you, but also to the earlier papers, I was asking myself, how can we measure, as it were, the importance of these notes, especially since they were not published at the time? And so I would like to know your view on whether we can somehow measure the importance of text in terms of the reception, yes, or in terms of the way in which they were taken over by others? Or do you think that that we should rather think of textual material as valuable in itself, regardless of whether these thoughts were taken up by others? Yes, so because so since it's very hard, I think, for an outsider at least, to make sense of his reflections, and since they in some way are very close to Fichte and in some way are not, it's difficult for me at least to assess the intrinsic value of the notes.
Yeah, thank you for this very difficult question in some way. I think we all three should answer to this, but I will try to give an answer because I think it depends on the perspective that you have. I mean, if you want to write an account of history of philosophy around 1800, then it is very difficult to include the Fichte studies, because indeed nobody has read this, so there is no reception of these papers. But then it's very different if you try to reconstruct Hardenberg's thinking from its beginnings to the end, because Hardenberg deals in the Fichte studies with problems that reappear throughout all his later writings and variations. He takes up issues that he has dealt with in the Fichte studies, again later find other answers. So the Fichte studies, as Violetta Waibel called it, is a Denkwerkstatt for him, where he tries several things out. And actually what I wanted to show in my paper is that Hardenberg, he had a new and very innovative insight at the beginning of the Fichte studies, but he was not able to explain this. And by trying to explain how the schematic relationship worked, he saw himself directed into several dead ends, into several aporias. So actually, the conception of language that he developed at the very end of the Fichte studies is the classical, the traditional and very conventional idea that you have a given intuition, and then you are free in creating a sign to designate this intuition. So it is actually, and that's the third perspective that you can take. If you understand the Fichte studies as a testimony of a thinker who is dealing with some of the most important questions at this time, the question of consciousness, but then the question of language and transcendental language that appeared, and other issues, then you will find answers that are innovative in a way, although they were not received by others. Yeah, they were received perhaps by other early romantics, by Friedrich Schlegel or so. But then it is something that you as a researcher can explore. I mean, you will something that has been nobody paid any attention to these texts. Yeah, so it's also surprising what kind of answers you find in these papers. So, as I said, it depends massively on the standpoint you take dealing with these papers.
Okay. Thank you. Well, then I go directly to Violetta Waibel because she has a question, but perhaps she also wants to say something about the value of the studies. You are still muted.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Okay.
Now, thank you. Thank you, Alexander Knopf, for this talk, and thank you for the question about the value of the Fichte studies. First, I want to ask something to Alexander Knopf. At the beginning of your talk, you spoke of the fact that Kant did only give us the transcendental philosophy, and Novalis, Hardenberg, did take into account into his transcendental reflections many empirical things, and this sounds to me as whether Hardenberg, in your reading, fills a kind of gap that Kant left back and that Hardenberg could fill. Is this what you wanted to say? If this is what you want to say, I wanted to remind that Kant says in the introduction of his the second edition of his first critique that he only could work out the transcendental philosophy, the system of principles, but that the next step is to write the metaphysics on the basis of this transcendental system of principles. Has this something to do, the one with the other? Also, what Kant himself says that he could not do, and that his followers had to do, following the famous Christian Wolff, he adds. Is this what you have in mind? This is the question. Maybe you want to give directly an answer, and then I say something on the validity of these Fichte studies. Okay.
Yeah, I give a direct answer. Thank you for the question, but this is not what I intended to say. I wanted to say that Hardenberg tries to answer with the Fichte studies to a discussion that was raised by the Kantian critique, and the basic assumption of Kant in the critique of pure reason and his transcendental philosophy is that the concepts, the categories, the transcendental ideas, and the concepts derived from the categories. So all the concepts that belong to the system that he developed are independent of their designation. So, for example, if you remember the passage on Platon and Platon's use of the concept of idea, he says that it is not surprising when somebody understands the creator of a certain concept better than this creator himself, which was Platon, because Platon didn't understand really the concept of idea, but Kant then did, and he was the first who did it, and then he found like the eternal and unchangeable meaning of the concept of idea. So this is the meaning that belongs to the transcendental concept of idea. So it is independent of designation. You can call it whatever. He says, okay, it's better to use the traditional and well-established concepts, but you can say whatever you want. It is even independent of translation to other languages, because the transcendental meaning of this concept will always be the same. So then what he claimed is that he has found also a kind of transcendental language belonging to the transcendental concepts. And this is an issue about which the community fell apart. And Reinhold was one of the first who point the finger to that problem. And Hardenberg knew very well these objections and tried to develop something like a transcendental language, and got into all these aporias, which eventually led him to a concept of design, which was again very traditional. But this was not the last step, because the really interesting part of his philosophy of language begins after the Fichte studies. So that's why you are right. The Fichte studies are a Denkwerkstatt, and it's not his last word. So it goes until his end, until his early end, until the Heinrich von Afterdingen, which is a novel full of a very different philosophy of language. But you have, if you want to judge about that, you have to follow him the whole way long.
Okay, thank you. Karin de Boer wanted to know what makes sense, what is the validity to read these Fichte studies. You can really, I take it like this, you can really ask yourself whether it makes sense to study them or not. On the one hand, they are the document of somebody who lived at that time, besides the big names that we know, and he tried to work out his own philosophy, but everything is fragment. And for this, you can ask yourself what makes more sense, to study Fichte or and Kant, or and Hegel, I don't know, or to look at these studies. It's sometimes very hard to read these Fichte studies, I would say myself. But if you really take your time, then you find really nuggets, you can say, some very fine things within these Fichte studies that are worth to be worked out and to look at, and to show what could be the core of these contexts. But really it is a series of fragments, and it has no final intention. It starts very often with some ideas, and one time they come at this point, then they start another way, and they come to another point, and for this it is worth to read it as Denkwerkstatt, because you can see how ideas make themselves. And this is one aspect, I think, of the validity of these Fichte studies.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps we go first to the two remaining questions, and then we can discuss perhaps also with James about the value, or what he considers to be the value of it. Perhaps first Lucas Scarfia.
Well, thank you very much to you all for this debate space and the opportunity to participate in it. My question is the following. I was wondering while hearing Professor Waibel, but I think the question has emerged in all three talks. I mean, whether there is not a contradiction, or at least a problem, as to how Hardenberg thinks on the task of philosophy, since he presents feeling as the feeling of a being, Sein, through Fichte Studien, while he further on in the same text, he argues that philosophy is orientated towards an idea of reason through reflection, right? And I think that that leaves us with, let's say, objects or matters of very different ontological or metaphysical weight for philosophy. And with respect to philosophy itself, maybe in the one hand as notiology or even as a religious thought. If I don't recall bad, he writes about this being as God in some of the fragments. Or in the other hand, as a propedeutic task, more like in the Kantian sense of the critique. So I was wondering how to reconcile these, or if you think that there is not really such a problem at all, right? Thanks again.
Yeah, thank you for this question. As I read this context and this problem, if Hardenberg asks for philosophy and he gives his answer with this interrelation, feeling and reflection, so he asks for the starting point of philosophy, and this is one answer to philosophy. But we have to see, as I often mentioned now, that he did not deliver a total system of philosophy, that he did not want to give the only answer to what philosophy is and has to do and so on. It is this strong question: how did human beings come to philosophize? And this is this aspect that I worked out. I only spoke on very few Fichte studies of these in total, these are 667 Fichte studies. Even if you only look on the Fichte studies, there are very interesting other parts of the reflections of Hardenberg, but he did not, and I think he did not want to work out a whole system of philosophy as he could see that Kant did, or Fichte, and so on. Yeah, this is my question, my answer to your question.
Thank you. And then there was a question by Anna Winkelmann. Do you still want to ask it? I guess so.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for very intriguing, interesting talks. And I have one very quick question. Is there any connection between concepts of drive and love in Novalis philosophy or Fichte? How are they connected? Isn't the love is a kind of drive?
And
the question is directed to Professor Waibel.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
I worked on drive. Neither Fichte nor Novalis reflected on this point, but on the systematic basis of what both made, I would say that love is some kind of drive. If you take drive as all activities that are belong to humanity, and in Fichte later in the system of ethics, you have a very interesting combination idea of drive, because he speaks of the drive that is combined of absolute drive and natural drive. And he did not speak about love, but I would say on the basis of Fichte that love is something that is a mixture of natural drive and absolute drive, because it has many things to do with our notions, with our understanding on the one side, but on the other side, it is based in our nature and in our nature. And for this, love should be for Fichte some combined drive. Fichte has this idea that every activity finally can be seen as drive, and love is not only passivity but much of activity. And as I have said and mentioned, Hardenberg does not differentiate the feelings he is speaking of. We should take into account later writings of Novalis, and maybe Alexander Knopf wants to say something on love and drive in the later Novalis. Some suggestion? No?
You were still muted, or you don't
Oh,
want.
now
Yeah.
it worked.
Yeah.
Do you hear me? Yeah. I can say at least that the concept of love becomes more and more important for Novalis. It becomes indeed a universal principle, and it is then indeed connected to the concept of drive as well. Perhaps not in the way that you would expect from knowing the Fichte studies, because Hardenberg is in his later writings no longer concerned with the question of the emergence of consciousness. But a good text to think about regarding these questions is the poem Astralis in his novel Heinrich von Afterdingen. Astralis is a spiritual being which in the process of speaking becomes incorporated, and Astralis is a product of love, and love is the driving force through which it is actually. Every action and every thinking is driven by love. So I mean, the love is and surely or certainly one of the basic principles in the novel. It is about a poet falling in love with a person and then overcoming all kind of terrestrial restrictions and so on. But in this text, Astralis, it is a kind of philosophical poem, and it deals with the first. It even deals with questions of consciousness, but I think this is one of the most explicit texts dealing with these questions.
Thank you.
Okay, then I propose that we close here the official part of the meeting. And as I announced, the Zoom meeting will of course stay open for some time so that we can have more informal discussions. Before I thank all speakers, I would like to say that on October 21, there will be a next session of the Leuven Seminar, and it will be a talk by Alistair Welchman, and the title of his talk will be A Defense of Schopenhauer's Account of Compassion. And there will be a response by Swami Medandana of Ayon Maharai University. No, that was false. It's a long name, of Ramakrishna Mission Vivekananda University. So I of course invite you all cordially to the next session. And then it's now my pleasure to thank all speakers of today. So Violetta, Waibel, James Reid and Alexander Knopf for very interesting talks and discussion. And I hope that you will be able to join us also for the informal discussion. So have a nice evening, those who go, and see you next time. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you very much.